Throughout my years in the tackle industry, there was one piece of fishing equipment that led to more confusion for the angler than just about anything else, and that was a humble old fishing rod. And you've only got to walk into any tackle store and have a look at the massive range of rods on display. It's enough to confuse anyone. So I'd like to give you a few little tips that might make that next purchase of your fishing rod just that little bit easier. Now, I don't want to get too scientific, but there's 4 key factors I think you need to keep in mind. The first one is the taper of the rod. Now, the taper of the rod is the way the rod goes from its thinnest point, right up near the tip section there, down to the butt section here. The other factors you need to keep in mind are the action of the rod, which is the way it bends, the line rating of the rod, and the cast weight of the rod. Along with that, you also need to keep in mind the material of the rod, whether it's graphite or fiberglass. So we'll talk a bit about the taper of the rod first. Like I said, the taper of the rod is the way in which the rod goes from its narrowest point at the tip to the widest point at the butt section here. Now, you get all sorts of different tapers. You get a fast taper, a medium taper, and a slow taper. But within that, you can get other variations as well. Now, the interesting thing about a taper is the taper of the rod will directly affect the action of the rod. Now, by action, I mean the way in which the rod bends. That's like this here. Now, generally what will happen is if you get a really fast tapered rod, a rod that goes from a really wide butt section right up to a narrow tip, you'll have a fast action. And by fast action, I mean a rod that bends pretty much in the top quarter of the rod there. A medium rod, on the other hand, or a medium taper, will have a medium action, and a slow taper will give the rod a much slower action all the way through. Now, which one you use, honestly, there's not really any hard and fast rules, but as a general guideline, most people lure fishing prefer a fast action rod, something nice and tippy so you can really punch that lure in and have plenty of power in the butt section. People bait fishing, on the other hand, prefer a slow tapered rod, and the reason for that is they don't want something too harsh when they're setting the hook on the fish. You need something that's got that little bit of give, a bit of an elastic band effect, I suppose you'd want to say. Now, another key factor, as I mentioned before, is the line class rating and the lure or casting weight on the rod. Now, these are ones that you really need to keep in mind. The companies build these rods with specific purposes in mind, and they try and help you out by giving you some of these line class ratings and weight ratings on the rod. Now, line class ratings, they'll generally cover between, say, a 4 to 5, 6 pound range. So by that I mean you may get one that's, say, a 4 to 8 pound line class, an 8 to 12 pound line class. Then you've also got your casting weights on here as well. Some will give them in grams and some will give them in ounces. It just depends on where the rod's made. Now, cast weights are a very important thing, especially if you're lure fishing. It's critical to get the right rod with the right cast weight on there. So it often doesn't hurt to have a good think about the type of fishing you're doing and the type of lure or bait you may be casting, so you can match the right weight up and the right line class up. And that alone will make a huge difference to the enjoyment you get out of your rod. Now, the other thing I mentioned as well was the 2 options of graphite and fiberglass. Now, you can get composites of the 2, but it's one of those things where the majority of your rods now are heading towards higher modulus graphites. High modulus graphite is really well suited to lure fishing, and the reason for that is because it's very light in weight, but it's also very, very responsive. And by responsive, I mean when you're fishing a lure through the water, you can feel all the vibrations coming directly through the rod, through the cork grips and straight to your hands. Fiberglass, on the other hand, tends to absorb a lot of that. It has a real shock absorber effect. So when you're fishing a lure with fiberglass, that rod tends to soak up a lot of the vibrations that you really need to feel so that you know exactly what your lure is doing. If you're bait fishing, on the other hand, that soft, sloppier action of fiberglass is what a lot of people prefer because it's a lot more forgiving. And by forgiving, I mean when you go to set the hook, the rod basically picks up and straightens the line out a lot more slowly than what a graphite rod does. So they're just a couple of little pointers just to keep in mind. Just to go through them again, you have the taper of the rod, the point at which it goes from its widest point to its narrowest point, the action of the rod, which basically means the way it bends, your cast weight and your line rating weight, and the materials of the rods, be it fiberglass or graphite. Now, I know it sounds like a lot, but if you kind of just have a little bit of a think about it, like I said, there's no hard and fast rules. It does come down to personal preference, but hopefully the few little tips I've given you there will make that little bit of extra difference so you can make an informed decision the next time you walk into your local tackle store and go to buy a new rod.